Before we get deeper into the faith and civic life statement specifically, wanted to just give a general introduction to the ELCA social statements as a whole. So the words you're seeing now come directly from the ELCA. Social statements are these teaching and policy documents that can help individuals, congregations, synods, our denomination as a whole think through social issues and specifically relate them to our faith. I think sometimes the existence of the social statement might even just teach a person that there is a connection between that issue and their faith, and it's okay to explore that issue within the context of a faith community. So these are really intended to kind of provide a framework and provide some direction in approaching what can be pretty complicated subjects. I think it's also worth noting that these ELCA social statements are actually intended to influence the advocacy work of the church. And I'll kind of get to that towards the end of the presentation, why I think that's notable. But these really are, important documents, as Jim will talk about. A lot of work goes into them, and they aren't just supposed to kind of collect dust on a shelf. They're really supposed to impact our interactions as congregations and the things that we do as various expressions of the church. Jim likes to use this phrase that I love, best wisdom of the church. That's really what these social statements are intended to reflect. That's not to say that these social statements are perfect. I think any one of these statements, some would say this went too far. Some might say this statement didn't go far enough, but they definitely reflect this concerted effort to pull a range of perspectives and voices and kind of informed by God's word, funnel those voices and perspectives into a coherent statement for the church. Oftentimes, the statements will even say, we make room in this church for a variety of perspectives, and here are what some of those perspectives are. And these statements also cover a broad range of issues. You can see this list here. These are just the social statements, with the most recent one being civic life. But there are also other public statements like social messages. Those don't go through church-wide assembly, but they do go through the church council. And of course, there are countless public statements that don't necessarily go through those same processes, but press releases, comments that are official from a bishop, official from a congregation, or presiding bishop. When there are these crisis moments, like what we see in Minneapolis, for example, you will often see these other public statements that are created. And then at a certain point, sometimes those kind of crisis moments and the quick, immediate reactions that we have start to funnel their way towards a solid statement that can guide future issues that the church might be facing. I think it's also worth noting when we talk about social statements that preachers or leaders in general in the church are not bound by these statements. A criticism that I hear sometimes of the ELCA's social statements, especially from offshoot Lutheran churches, is that we have these statements and we force everybody to get on board with them and you're going to preach on them and all that. And that's not really what happens. I think there's a decent number of leaders in the church who haven't looked at most of these. I certainly was not quizzed on them when I went through the ordination process. We're bound by the word of God. We are working within the context of our confessional heritage, and these social statements draw from both, but we're not bound to them. They're really there to guide and to give us a framework in which we can reflect on social issues. And
So I want to just say quickly about how these social statements are developed. And I had some personal experience with this a long time ago. In 2001, I was elected to what was then the Board for Church and Society. And one of the tasks of that board was to oversee the development of social statements. So when I got on the board in 2001 was also the time when the board was to oversee consideration of the fuller inclusion of gay and lesbian people in the church and work towards developing a social statement. And so I would go to Chicago twice a year for the Board for Church and Society, and then I got appointed as the Board of Church and Society's representative to the development of to the Sexuality Task Force, which was doing those two things, thinking about fuller inclusion of gay and lesbian people and developing the social statement. So for several years, I would go to Chicago. So they met 3 times a year. So for several years, I was going to Chicago 5 times a year, and it was a lot when I was, teaching full time and raising kids and all that.
Mhm.
But I got to be at the churchwide offices all those times and see the people that work there, and I was blown away with the faithfulness, the creativity, the smarts, the commitment of the people that work at Churchwide. And I just I wish everybody could have that experience of getting to see Churchwide up close. Anyway, um, so the way a social statement gets going is that a synod proposes the need for a social statement on a particular topic. And then it goes to the churchwide assembly, and the assembly has to approve the development of the statement. And so then it's launched. The presiding bishop's office provides oversight, and a task force is established. Back in the day when I was there were 13 members of the sexuality task force and 9 advisory members. And those people worked really hard for a long time. The task force uh, includes, both people that have expertise. So you got theologians, people with knowledge of sociology or politics or whatever is germane, um, and then also people affected by the issue. So we had on that sexuality task force years ago, we had 1 gay and 1 lesbian member, and we had some people that were um, pretty strongly opposed to further inclusion. So they work for months or even years. A statement gets developed, and then it goes out for responses from congregations, synods, churchwide, the Conference of Bishops. And then changes are made, and it comes to the churchwide assembly, and it requires a 2/3 majority to pass. So when I say, these statements reflect the best wisdom of the church, you can see it's a long and involved process, and it involves a lot of people with expertise and with that are affected by the area of concern. So I think not all denominations have these kind of social statements, and I think there's something we should be proud of, and I think they are, you know, one of the best kept secrets in our church because they don't get the use that they deserve.
Yeah, and I personally am very grateful for all of the hard work that Jim just described and all the people who have contributed to the creation of these social statements. They've actually had a pretty significant impact on my own journey of faith and discernment, and I would argue play a role in me being here right now, talking to all of you with the caller. I want to jump back in time to 2009 to the churchwide assembly that was held in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Of course, for folks who don't know, churchwide assembly is this gathering that happens every few years in the ELCA. This is like our main big decision-making body. And one of the big decisions that they were wrestling with in 2009 was whether or not to adopt the social statement that Jim was just talking about on human sexuality. And this statement, if adopted, would allow for fuller participation and the ordination of folks in the LGBTQIA plus community. So while people were gathered in Minneapolis for this assembly, I was not there. I was at home in Stillwell, Kansas. I was 16 years old at the time. Uh, and I have this really vivid memory of booting up the computer. I was probably supposed to be working on like a summer homework assignment, but instead I typed in elca.org. I was just kind of curious, wanted to learn more about the denomination I had been raised in. I don't know exactly what piqued my curiosity that night. I know that around the time that I was 16 and 17, a lot of my friends and I were kind of comparing notes about our church backgrounds. I discovered I had friends who were Methodist and Catholic and Mormon and not religious at all. And I remember hearing a lot of theological perspectives growing up in a fairly conservative part of Kansas that didn't reflect what I that didn't quite match my theological perspective. And so I think I was just curious. I wanted to learn more about my denomination and other denominations. So I just kind of happened to pull up the ELCA's website, and it just so happened to be, August 2009. So I tuned in to the ELCA as they were wrestling with this big decision. And when I pulled up the website, I discovered that we had adopted this social statement. And I had no idea that we even had social statements until I saw that. I certainly didn't know about all the conflict and controversy. I didn't have maybe the same critical eye that I might have now on some of these statements that I probably wish went further in some ways. I was definitely pretty naive, but I was also really overjoyed. I was 16 years old in my room looking at this social statement, thinking about people I know, people I love, and thinking they could have a place, like a loving and affirming place in my church. And this is an expression of faith that's different than some of what I hear at school. It's more consistent with what I feel to be true about God, and it's
Mm.
consistent with what my parents have taught me. And I just remember thinking, all right, ELCA, this is cool. Like I might stick around. I'm intrigued by this. I'm motivated by this. And so that was this like really powerful moment for me in 2009. And then if you jump ahead to 2015, I have definitely stuck around. At this point, I'm a couple months into my first year in seminary. I've gotten really involved in community organizing, especially around economic justice issues. There's this huge protest being planned in downtown Chicago. It's like this big coalition effort with groups from around the state. We're calling for a just end to this budget crisis. And I've decided to do civil disobedience, which is pictured here. So this was the first time of several in seminary that I did civil disobedience, or CD. It was a peaceful protest. It was peaceful civil disobedience. We just sat in front of the Chicago Board of Trade and refused to move until the police carried us away. I could say so much about this experience. It's one of the most important spiritual moments I've ever had. I referenced it in a sermon recently at First, and talked about how it made real for me the idea of the body of Christ, just everybody chanting, everyone together. We were singing hymns in the police van because this was a particularly like faith-led protest. So this is like a super important moment in my faith journey, and it's like month 2 of seminary or something. And then some weeks later, this arrest stuff is behind me. I now have a record. I'm preparing to be entranced or accepted into the process to be ordained in the ELCA, and I'm starting to like fully panic that my ordination or candidacy committee is not going to like the fact that I have an arrest record, that I now have, convictions for criminal trespassing and reckless conduct or whatever the charges were. And I'm hearing these horror stories from people who are like, oh, my committee was clear, like, don't get involved in that. And I don't know anyone on my committee. I have no idea how they're going to feel. I definitely did not ask permission before I got arrested. So I'm like panicked that my ordination journey is going to end before it starts. And one day before class, I was kind of talking about this with one of my professors, Dr. Richard Perry. And he said, minutes before class started, you should check out our church's social statement on church and society. So right as class got out, I made a beeline for the library, pulled up the statement, printed it, started furiously highlighting it so I could defend myself if my committee was mad that I had been arrested. Fortunately, my committee was very cool here in the Central State Synod. They were very supportive, but I was ready. And I think more importantly, I felt really affirmed and validated in my organizing and justice work. Just like in 2009, I had this sense that, yeah, I do want to be here. There's a place for me in this church. I felt like I had language to not just justify getting arrested, but to just in general talk about this work of seeking justice and organizing. So both in 2009 and then again in 2015 with a statement that was adopted before I was even born, I feel like these social statements gave me guidance. They made me feel like included in my church and made me feel more hopeful about my church. And so it's, maybe like I've been told it's nerdy that I was looking at social statements when I was 16, but they really impacted me. They meant a lot to me and they still mean a lot to me. And so I think all of those experiences inform why I think these statements are important and why I'm really grateful for this newest one that we're now going to dive into about faith and civic life. Oh, you're muted, Jim.
Okay, so let's talk about this. As we said, it was just adopted last summer at the churchwide assembly. And it is a particularly long document. I think it may be the longest of the social statements. It's 92 pages, which it's a lot, but it's good. It's really good. Okay, so here's the outline. There's an uh, introduction, and then section one kind of sets the theme. God acts for the well-being of all through civic life. And uh, section two, God calls all people. So we believe this is a calling of God to all people to be involved in civic life. And then there's the next two sections. Um, the next three sections really are about um, our situation in the United States with our form of government, religion in the First Amendment, and then um, constructive ways that religious organizations can interact with political authority. And then finally, there's some selected contemporary concerns in civic life, and we will note those later because sometimes these kind of statements, I mean, they're meant to last for a long time. And so sometimes they don't focus on, the most current issues, but I think they just felt the urgency with what's going on in our society in these days that they needed to name some particularly important uh, issues. And so they do that in that section. Okay, I want to talk about the theological grounding for for this statement. What's the theology? So I'm a professor of theology, so this is something I was excited to do, and Samantha said, "Okay, you can do that part." Uh, so the statement really begins with the Lord's Prayer, especially that petition, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." So God's will is really the basic theological grounding for this. So we could say that this work has a theocentric focus. I mean, obviously, it's going to get to what we humans are supposed to do, but it starts with God, with God's will, and the claim that God is at work caring for all of creation. So it starts with God, and God is at work, and then we're called, interesting, they say, we are called to understand and join in this work. So, we need to observe and think and analyze where is God at work and then seek to join in. Um, so they start with it struck me that some of the themes that they start with are universal themes. I mean, they come out of a Christian perspective, but they're claims about all people or even all of creation. So one of the first things they talk about is the Imago Dei, the image of God, which we hear about in Genesis. Um, and again, the claim, of course, is that all people are made in the image of God. And that means that all people have dignity, agency, and that vocation to join into God's work. Um, and then what is God's will? Well, they're pretty quick to say God's will is shalom, which, is a very rich word that means peace and wholeness and even prosperity. Shalom for all creation. So again, not just for all humans, but all of creation. And then there's also very quickly, when they talk about Christ, they note very quickly that Christ died for all people, and that we are called to serve all people, which is part of the baptismal liturgy that we do. Um, just this is a little bit of an aside, but I was really struck by this. This is not an extensive theological tome. They just name some ideas and say a sentence or two about them, but they talk about God's sovereignty. What does it mean to say God is sovereign? And they say that to talk about God as all powerful is to talk about God as the source of all power. Now, some people will say, if we say God is all powerful, that means that everything that happens is a result of God's activity. And that's really problematic. And so they have this other view of God being all powerful, that the God is the source of all power, but then that God gives power to creatures. So the way God is, God overflows in creativity and in love and in power and gives power to us and to other creatures to shape our world. So we have these human capacities uh, to express power and be involved, especially here in civic life. And it's very interesting. They the human capacities that they list as really important: reason, imagination, experience, and emotion. And all of those can be in the service of civic life. And I think that affirmation of reason is significant for at least two reasons. One is some of us will remember that Luther could call reason the devil's whore. He could be really critical, reason is evil. Now, he said that when he was thinking about human reason trying to reach up to God, or human reason as a power that could grant us, bring us to salvation. So he didn't like reason when used that way. In other ways, he thought human reason was a tremendous gift from God. The second reason I think that reason is important, and this affirmation is important, is that one of the most important expressions of our human reason in our day is science. And this document is going to affirm the importance of science and scientific insight into the world, that it should inform our approach to health and medication, that it should inform our approach to the environment. So just wanted to note that about those capacities. Um, so I want to talk a little bit about some of the Lutheran themes that come in there. And again, I'll lift up that one of vocation, vocation or calling, that we are all called. We're all called in this document to civic engagement. And that means, from our point of view, not just Christians are called to that, but all people are called to that. And that theme of vocation is an important one historically for us, because in Luther's day, vocation referred to a calling to be a priest or to be a member of a religious order. And no one else was thought to have vocation. And Luther expands that enormously and says, we all have vocation, not just those of us who are called to ministry or called to the religious life, but everybody has vocation. Everybody is called by God. So to be a school teacher or to be a parent or to be a scientist or to be a trash collector or all the roles and responsibilities that we have are all part of our vocation. And I think that's a really important part of our heritage that we need to not forget. Second Lutheran theme there is great realism about human sinfulness, that sin is widespread, um, and that everything is tainted by sin, everything human is tainted by sin. And very importantly, very early on, they want to say sin is both personal and it's collective. So uh, sin is not just, you know, individual things that we do or an individual condition, but it affects all of our social structures. So we talk about systemic sin. Um, there's some discussion of law and gospel and talk about how God, curbs sin through the law, but also shows us how to live, and that the gospel then frees us. But there's also that Lutheran theme of simul justus et peccator is the Latin phrase. We are at the same time justified and sinners. And so there's no thought that we leave sin behind. And for our thinking about civic life, I think one way that's really important is that provides a guard against triumphalism, right? So because sin clings to us, we have no ground to claim that we have the absolute truth. But also our limits, our finitude limits us, and our brokenness limits us. So we have no grounds for making claims to absolute truth. And in fact, the document is really clear to say that we as Christians have no corner on civic truth. That others have things to contribute, and we need to be in dialogue with others to try to discern what is, and one of the terms I want to use a lot is the common good. What is the common good? What's good for all? What's good, uh, broadly speaking? Um, okay. Uh, so another element of the theological grounding, I think there are themes from uh, liberation theology that are here in the document. And one of the things that will is important to lift up is this clear rejection of white supremacy, and a clear rejection of anti-black racism and all other forms of racism. Especially there's a lot of attention given to racism against indigenous peoples. So picking up those liberation themes. And then a final theological grounding I'd like to mention is this rejection of colonialism, which is really a complex and difficult issue for us as Christians because um, European colonialism all over the world brought Christianity with it. And often Christianity was forced on the people that were colonized. Um, so we have a lot of work and a lot of repentance to do around that. One of the ways they talk about colonialism is talking about the government today and unincorporated territories. So Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands and other places that are territories, including Washington, D.C., um, that are underrepresented or even disenfranchised politically in a lot of ways. So they also note the kind of colonial legacy and oppression of Native Americans, Alaskan Natives, and Native Hawaiians, um, and they also propose some ways that we can respond to those evils and help to try to overcome them. And then a rejection of what's called the doctrine of discovery, which, you know, many of us may not have heard of, but it's um, a 15th century doctrine promulgated by the Pope, who said to the European explorers, um, whatever areas in the Americas or in Asia that you discover, you have the right to inhabit and take over. And so that really governed, especially Latin America. But it also gets picked up by the US as a way to support the notion of manifest destiny, and that uh, we white Americans have the right to all of North America. Um, so that's a quick look at the theological grounding. Oh, and yeah, I'm supposed to do this piece, right? Key sections.
Yeah, so we are not going to do all 92 pages of the social statement. Instead, Jim and I each kind of picked some sections of this social statement that we thought were worth lifting up. And so Jim will start with some content in the statement about Christian nationalism.
Yeah. And so there is a short but really substantive discussion of Christian nationalism. And it is critiqued as an unhealthy form of patriotism. So it's critiqued from a theological point of view as being idolatrous, because the kind of loyalty that many or most Christian nationalists give to their movement is the kind of loyalty that is due to God alone. And so there's that theological critique of Christian nationalism. And I think it's really important what the document calls a hardline form of Christian nationalism is white Christian nationalism. And those that have looked carefully at the history and development of recent forms of Christian nationalism notice that they're deeply racist and thinks that only white people should have place. The document also critiques Christian nationalism as being un-American. So it doesn't fit with our democratic republic because it substitutes we, the self-declared true American Christians, for we the people. Um, and so it rejects the real idea of e pluribus unum, out of many one. It rejects pluralism, and we think to affirm and recognize diversity is really important.
So, another key idea in the social statement is that we are all called to engage in civic life. That's basically the whole focus of section two. And as a pastor, as a community organizer, I'm probably most drawn in statements like these to the most actionable ideas for the church. In other words, what does this actually look like for us to embody the theology that Jim was just talking about? What does it actually look like for the church to be engaged in civic life? So I pulled some of the examples from this lengthy social statement that kind of give some concrete ideas. I love that the social statement references worship. I think a lot of folks hear the phrase civic life and they might think these are things that take place entirely outside of the church. You know, this is voting on election day. This is a picture like what I shared from that protest. But as this statement points out, worship actually prepares us for going out into the world, and thus it prepares us for civic engagement. I even heard in our small group at the beginning, someone mentioned, we don't have programs set up related to ICE, but, it does come up in church. And I would say to anyone who's in that position, that is your church being engaged in civic life. Worship is one area where civic life can take place, and it's probably the first place for faith communities. And that can look like preaching, when your pastor or whoever gives a sermon and talks about a current issue or a social issue that is engaging civic life. The prayers of intercession, when we say a prayer for people who are hungry because the government is shut down, when we say a prayer for people in Minneapolis, our prayers are moving us in the direction of, a robust civic life. The document even talks about the passing of the peace as a time in worship when we embody this, shalom, or this peace that we're called to then go bring out into the world. And I would argue that even our hymns can sometimes move us in the direction of civic life. One of the first church services, when I started at first, we sang Streams of Living Justice, I think is the name of the hymn, is our sending song. And people had tears in their eyes as they were coming out of the sanctuary and talked about how moving that song was and how it represented what they're thinking and feeling and hoping for. And, without question, I think the music in that service was preparing us and equipping us to go out and join in God's work. So worship is a place where civic life can begin. And it might be the place where we are nourished to go back out again and again and keep participating in civic life. Social ministries are also a means of civic participation. These are things that tend to be, I think, widely accepted as, within the purview of church, where it might be a little bit more controversial to go to a protest for some context. I think most everyone is on board with supporting, food pantries or clothing pantries or other social ministries. These are also expressions of civic life. And I think it's good to point out some of these more widely accepted things like praying for people or social ministries for congregations that might be a little more hesitant to get into this, to just kind of point out the ways that we're already engaged in civic life as kind of a starting point for us to wonder about new ways of doing ministry or mission or engaging in civic life. Another thing that they lift up in the social statement is something that churches can do is to provide space to have challenging conversations. A safe space doesn't mean everybody agrees. In fact, often we don't all agree, but the church can be that place where those conversations happen. My first call was in a small conservative town in rural Nebraska. I engaged topics like this very differently there than I do in my current context at First Lutheran. But some of the best kind of success stories I feel like I have in that first call as a pastor were when we had hard conversations. I was there from August 2019 through the beginning of the pandemic and, the George Floyd summer. I gave a sermon once where I talked a little bit about race, kind of trying to figure out where we might be at as a congregation. And the next day, one of the kind of patriarchs in the church knocked on the door of the parsonage, asked if we could sit down and chat about my sermon. And we had this, socially distanced, 6 feet apart, wearing masks, awkward conversation about race and about the sermon and about why I thought it was important to talk about it and where he was coming from. And we did not end that conversation in the same place, but it was so respectful. We heard each other. We learned why we came at this from different backgrounds, what my life experiences had taught me, what his life experiences had taught him. And to me, that captures, what we see in Section 2, Article 14 of this social statement, providing space to have those challenging conversations. That's also part of civic life. And I think especially in our current political climate where it's so hard to talk to and hear each other, I think the church can be a leader in saying we can still be in relationship with each other, we can still listen to each other, we can still talk to each other. And that's engaging in civic life too. So you don't have to have, consensus on every tricky issue before your church can, kind of follow the model of this social statement. Another way that the social statement outlines for a church to be engaged in civic life is to fulfill this prophetic role. I highlighted what I think are some of the more pertinent parts of this section, but I think this is where engaging in civic life can feel a lot riskier for different congregations. The social statement, I think, does a pretty good job of encouraging caution and prudence and just being aware of your context. Speaking prophetically in one environment isn't going to look and sound the same as it would in another. But this is really, I think, inviting the church to take a stance on things, to call things out when they're abusive, call things out when they're harmful, call out systems that are not working for our most vulnerable neighbors, including calling out specific civic leaders and institutions who might be acting in a way that is, harmful, that is inconsistent with what we hear in scripture. And I think this, again, can be kind of a riskier step in the direction of discipleship and civic life. But I think the social statement does a good job of pointing out where this is, biblically consistent. The Magnificat is prophetic language from Mary. We have prophetic language from Jesus. There's, of course, the prophetic books. And so we have this prophetic heritage in the church. And I think this social statement does a good job of inviting us to embrace that heritage and at a minimum explore it, and knowing that that exploration is going to look and feel and sound different in different places. And then finally, moving out of section 2, I think section 5 and section 1 also have some nice ideas about what it looks like to be engaged in civic life as a church. Section 5 talks about, again, kind of taking a stance on specific policies and legislation. There is an explicit differentiating between endorsing a policy versus endorsing an elected official or a politician or a political party. This kind of goes back to some of the things that Bishop Donna talked about in the first presentation, the difference between political and partisan. This social statement is not inviting people into partisanship. It's very clear that that's not where the church is called. But that doesn't mean that we can't have a position on policy issues. If there is a issue going on in your town or your state or nationally that has to do with hunger, for example, maybe it's SNAP, maybe it's school lunches. Matthew 25 has something to say about feeding people. The story of Jesus feeding the 5,000 might tell us something about feeding people. And it's okay for us as individual Christians, certainly, but even as congregations and synods and the church as a whole, to take a stance on policy and on legislation. And then finally, I had to include the line about nonviolent, public protests and civil disobedience as expressions of faith that are very close to my heart. But you see that represented in this social statement as well. And I think what's really beautiful about this statement is that it's has a very one body, many members vibe. There are different ways to engage civic life. What works in one context won't immediately work in another. I think it would be interesting to share some of these examples of civic engagement with the congregation and say, where do you see yourself reflected in these ideas? Where do you not see yourself? Are some of these ideas non-starters, or are some of these ideas a little bit intriguing? I think sometimes we have almost a failure of imagination in the church about just what our ministries can look like. And I think social statements like this give us some, nuggets of inspiration that we might recoil from at first, at least, but might kind of plant a seed that fosters a new way of thinking about church. So these are some, I think, cool illustrations of a civically engaged church that I wanted to share with all of you.
Yeah, I want to just quickly talk about the final section of the document names these issues that it finds particularly troubling. The hyper-partisan polarization. And it has suggestions for how we can work at overcoming that. The issue of misleading and inflammatory discourse, the promotion of falsehoods. So, the truthfulness and honesty in communication. The outsized role of money in politics, especially dark money that we can't track. We don't know where it came from. And it talks about, government can do some things that are less than good, but there's also structured oppression in the government. And the examples they lift up are voter suppression and gerrymandering. The disenfranchisement of the U.S. territories, that was also a topic of conversation. The oppression of American Indians, Alaska Natives and Native Hawaiians. And here's um, a lack of honest, comprehensive civics. I'm sorry, that should be education. And the next one is about engagement, but they're really calling for uh, people, students need to know civics. They need to know how our government is set up and how it's supposed to work. And then um, lack of constructive civic engagement by too many people. A lot of people that um, have kind of dropped out and maybe cynical or maybe feeling hopeless. So those are some issues that they lay out, and I just wanted to lift those up for you.
So we've, talked about social statements in general, the theological grounding for this particular faith and civic life statement, some of the things that we think are especially striking about it. And I think all of this, with probably any social statement, leads to this question of, well, how do we actually use this in our faith communities? So we came up with some ideas. I think one starting point is just individual discernment. The story I shared at the beginning is about how social statements were pretty formative for me as I was discerning my place in the church. It's, I think, not only a tool for discerning if this feels like a good spiritual home for you in the ELCA, but also discerning, well, what is my opinion about this issue? Uh, I think when things come up in the news and you're wondering, well, what does my faith have to say about that? Social statements can be instructive and kind of help guide an individual person's thinking on that. Social statements can also be used in group settings, for group discussions. Again, how you use a social statement, especially one like this, is going to differ based on the context that you're in. I think even in a context where maybe people you can expect, are not going to be as open to some of the content, I think they still are useful and maybe kind of exegeting the assembly, so to speak. We talk about as preachers, exegeting the text, interpreting it. What is this saying to us? But we can do the same with each other, with our faith communities. Where are we at on these issues, like a temperature check of sorts? And I think if you pitch a social statement, certain parts of it, maybe not all of it at once, and make it clear that I'm offering this not to say this is how you ought to think. I'm offering it to see what you think about it and what your feelings are as you read this. And it's just to foster some discussion and reactions. I think that can be helpful for people to get a sense of, where is my congregation? I think there are some of us pastors who kind of assume that if we talk about some of these things, it's going to cause a huge conflict. And we're told all along in seminary to meet your people where they are, but sometimes we don't know where our people are. And I think social statements can be helpful in assessing that and figuring out what is a good starting place for us. In other contexts, I think social statements like this one might be consistent with where a congregation is at. Jim and I actually invited the justice group at first to kind of read and react to this social statement. And, they experienced it as being really affirming and validating, and talked about how this statement made them feel like, they're not alone in thinking that their faith speaks to our current moment in the way that it does. For some congregations, it might inspire new expressions of ministry. So I think figuring out exactly how to use a social statement for a group discussion depends on your context, but I think they can be a really, rich resource in that way. They can also be a resource for preaching. We're talking about using it directly, like I'm going to take parts of this social statement and bring it to my context and see what they think. But you could also, as a preacher, use these social statements to help flesh out a sermon that you want to give. If you're like, I feel really drawn to, talk about civic life this week, or this text is really interesting about creation, and I want to get some better language for what our church says about caring for the earth. We have these statements that mean you don't have to like reinvent the wheel or start from scratch every single time you want to give a public statement or preach on a public issue. An idea that came up in our justice group was to utilize these social statements for our own public expressions of faith or in our ongoing efforts. So, for example, one of our members was interested in quoting the civic life statement in her weekly correspondence with various elected officials. I think she found the language pretty persuasive and powerful, and thought, maybe my elected official would be interested to have this perspective. So again, you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you want to talk prophetically or faithfully about a social issue. I would also argue that social statements can be used to hold church leadership accountable. The ELCA itself says that these social statements should guide the advocacy and ministry and work of the church. And I think if a person felt like, I haven't heard anybody talk about this from the pulpit, or I don't know that my synod has said anything on this, referring to these social statements could provide really good language to explain, why you think you should be hearing that at church. And I think basically every pastor I know would love it if people in the congregation were asking, to hear about some of these social issues. And, you can help and support your pastor and your PMA and whoever's in your pulpit by, kind of getting used to these social statements and knowing what they say and, using them to say, I think we do need to talk about these things. I want to invite people to, in the chat, share ideas they have for how they might use this social statement in their context. I also wanted to invite Chad to share about an example of when he used a social statement in his setting. I know Jim knows a little more about this than I do.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a great example or not, but a few years ago we did a sermon series on women in the Bible, and it happened to be the summer that just before the ELCA voted on the Women in Justice social statement. And so they had released a summary of it, which was a few pages long. And so every week that summer in worship, we started by reading a part of it, a paragraph, a couple paragraphs or whatever. I thought that seemed like a great idea. The problem was it didn't allow for any conversation. And my plan was at the end of the summer to have a study on it and have some conversation. Well, right off the bat, I had some members really ticked off at me. One member in particular who caught me, he didn't tell me this until months later, but when we asked him to serve on council and he refused because he wasn't going to serve in the ELCA anymore, he'd still come to worship, but wasn't going to serve. And it was because that statement right off the bat says that patriarchy is a sin. And it names patriarchy as a sin. And the problem is that this man was the patriarch in his family. He was the oldest male in his family, and he had a very large family in the congregation, and he took care of them. And he really was like this grandfatherly figure to everyone, and everyone kind of looked up to him. He saw himself as a patriarch. We called him a patriarch. And that statement clearly said it was patriarchy is a sin. So I had to kind of talk him off the ledge a little bit, but we do have to be careful as we use these because people may not have the same depth or same understanding of the language. So I encourage you to, I guess, use them more for conversation than from the pulpit, perhaps.
Thanks. That's helpful. Yeah, if anyone else has ways that they have used or might use this or other social statements, I think we'd love to see that in the chat. And then if people have any questions or comments, we're all ears.
I have a question for Jim. And Jim, I'll admit I haven't read the 92 pages, but you've had considerable experience in several of these statements. And I want to go back to some of your observations about the theological perspective. And we see references to God and references to Christ. Where do we see the Holy Spirit fitting into this picture?
That's interesting. I don't recall any mention of the Spirit. I mean, there's an affirmation of the Trinity, but in terms of specific discussion of the role of the Spirit, which, yeah, could be really important.
I think that's all part of that conversation, that individual discernment is the Holy Spirit's guidance in that reflection and the subsequent conversations. And yet there's no, I didn't see any, at least from the conversation, any clear reference to that.
It may be there and I missed it, but I didn't see it. So that's
thank you.
Very astute, Keith.
Well, and if you search for it, it only comes up 4 times. And I think 3 of those times are just acknowledging the Trinity. And then the 4th time is talking about, forced conversion of indigenous people and acknowledges that as Lutherans, we believe the Holy Spirit brings faith to people and thus it should not be forced or coerced by human action. But that's also a very,
narrow,
specific,
very narrow application. Very narrow application.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you.
You did say this is 90 pages, right?
Yeah.
We've only seen just a little bit of it tonight. So it's hard to say right off the bat that such and such is or is not included in these 90 pages.
Mhm. Yeah, I think by contrast, the human sexuality statement is 46 pages. So
Yeah.
this is, almost double.
Mhm. Mhm. And that was the first thing when we showed it. We showed it to our justice group at First Lutheran. That was their first response. This is way too long. I said, well, that's what happens when you get a bunch of academics together to work on something.
There are some comments in the chat. Mandy mentioned that as someone who is not ordained in the ELCA, the social
Mm.
statements help her to speak the language of the ELCA.
Uh,
And then Janice noted how the social statements are part of the backbone of training for others. So the Care for Creation social statement is used in training coaches. So those are some cool ways that people use the social statements.
huh.
All right. Thank you all for listening and for engaging
Yes,
with the statement.
Thank you very much.
we appreciate it. And if you have other thoughts, we're open to receiving emails or conversations.
Thank you both so much for being here tonight. I did want to point out that we have published the recordings for the first two of this three-part series on our YouTube page, Kifa Kansas Interfaith Action on YouTube. You can search for us on YouTube and find that, or you can go to our website, kansasinterfaithaction.com, and there's a link to the to the YouTube there. And we will also put this recording up when it's ready to, for folks who might be interested or who might like to come back to it and check it out. There has been a wealth of information in these three series. Bishop Donna came on just a little bit ago. So I want to thank her for her series, her first presentation on Christian nationalism, and Samantha and Jim. So grateful for your presence here tonight. It's been really helpful for me to be with you all these last three
Mm.
presentations. I find that this conversation is exactly what I need in these moments. So I am grateful to each of you. If you are not signed up for emails from Kifa, you can also do that on our website, again, kansasinterfaithaction.org. And we do events like this with a variety of partners. So we'd love to have you with us anytime. Whether you live in Kansas or not, it's mostly relevant to anyone. So please join us anytime.